Hey guys, thanks for tuning in to another video on ForgottenWeapons.com. I'm Ian McCollum, and today we're going to talk about the Mauser train. This is a really cool little side note from the very end of World War II. I mentioned it obliquely in a previous video, and a lot of people were very interested in it. So we're going to go into a little more detail today. Now, before we start, I want to say that what I'm going to describe is primarily taken from this excellent book written by Leslie Field and Bas Martens about Ott-Helmuth von Lossnitzer. This is basically a translation of his personal autobiography, or his transcripted recollections of what it was like to be a technical director for the Mauser company from 1933 until 1945. Lossnitzer was actually the man who was largely responsible for this evacuation of Mauser personnel and prototypes and knowledge and such. And his autobiography is fascinating, by the way. It's got tons of interesting detail on all sorts of highly technical firearms stuff, because that's what he did. He was technical director for Mauser's Research and Development Division prior to and during World War II. So if you're interested, and if you can find a copy, this is a small print book that may well be out of print by now, you can check it out. I also want to point out that if you're interested in what the Allies found both at Mauser and in the Mauser train, well, they wrote a like 400-page report on it, which has been transcribed and republished by Peter Dahlhammer. And I'll have links at the end. If I can find Lossnitzer's book still available for sale, I'll put that in the description text. I know you can get Dahlhammer's transcription of the original Mauser visit report by CIOS, or the Combined Intelligence Objective Subcommittee. All right, with all that out of the way, let's talk about what this train actually was. So we'll pick up the story in February of 1945. Germany is clearly losing the war badly, and in February, a daytime bomber raid destroys the power station at the Mauser factory in Oberndorf. Lossnitzer actually reports that from this point on, he had no heating in his office at Mauser, because it was the power station that did that. So he had a very cold office for the next month and a half or so. And this started the process of people thinking about, hey, maybe we need to move some of our operations to a place that's a little safer. Specifically, Albert Speer, the Minister of Supply and logistical head of Nazi Germany, decided that they should relocate Mauser's research and development operations, like the key ongoing stuff, the new weapons and the new developments. They wanted to relocate those down to the Alps near the German, Austrian, Italian border area, into an area that could be much more properly defended. And originally the idea was they expected this to be 6 or 8 weeks. Like, we'll move down there, we'll keep working kind of remotely. We'll do a work from home thing, work from the Alps thing, for 6 or 8 weeks, and then we'll be able to go back to the actual factory complex in Oberndorf, because by that time, surely all of our wonder weapons and special strategies will have kicked the Allies back out of Germany, and we'll be able to go back to the factory. Obviously, that didn't happen, but that was the initial plan. Now, in order to get to this area, well, they had a lot of stuff to carry. They were kind of, Lossnitzer and his fellow administrative level guys were kind of given, like, you take what you need to continue your work. And so they came up with this list of which weapons projects were worthy of continuing, what do we need to be able to continue experimentation or possibly development of these guns. And so they came up with a package of basically drawings, testing materials, production gauges, weapons components, samples, like everything related to the newest ongoing stuff. For context, like, they left behind everything involved in .22 caliber rifle production, which the French would find when they occupied Oberndorf in April, and the French would use that and put those rifles into production. What the French didn't find were things relating to specifically the Mauser Volkspistol, the simplified mass production handgun that was in process at Mauser, the Sturmgewehr 45, that's the gun that would become H&K's roller delayed system. It was a delayed blowback, 8mm Kurz. It's not really an adaptation of the Sturmgewehr 44. It would have been the replacement for the Sturmgewehr 44. They had components for 30 sets of components for Sturmgewehr 45s, and those all went on what would become the train. And perhaps most substantially, Mauser was working on aircraft cannon, and those were really probably seen as the most important work that they were doing at the time. Specifically, they were working on 50 and 55 millimeter aircraft cannon intended for the Me-262 jet fighters. And that stuff, that all goes like, we're going to take that with us. So now the next problem they have is, okay, we've got all this stuff that we want to take on the evacuation, and there's a railroad track in Oberndorf. The problem is Oberndorf is like this rural, dinky little town, far like outweighed by the importance of the Mauser factory that's built up in it, especially over the war years. But the railroad infrastructure is not all that great, and the railroads leading out of Oberndorf specifically don't have any connections that allow them to get down to where they want to be in the Alps. So instead, they have to dig up enough trucks to move all of this material to the town of Ravensbrück in Württemberg, where there is a rail line that's actually going in the right direction. And that takes some time to actually arrange. And it is like April 15th by the time they've got trucks available. They've got some automobiles as well. And they're going to take what would eventually become 29 boxcars worth of stuff and people. About between 200 and 250 people join this evacuation. And most of them apparently make their way to Ravensbrück by bicycle, because there's so much material loaded in the trucks that there's not room for 200 extra people. So everyone gets to Ravensbrück. They get out of Mauser literally days before the French army marches into Oberndorf, and begin what Lossnitzer explains this in a rather dry and he doesn't make a lot of the journey, but reading between the lines, you can tell that this had to be like an action movie adventure of a trip, and absolutely terrifying, deadly at every turn sort of potential trip, because right off the bat, first off, they have to find a steam engine to get them out of Ravensbrück and on their way. I should point out, at this time, the last couple of months while Lossnitzer is trying to arrange all this stuff, he's driving here and there to meet important people and arrange things. He's doing this in a Mercedes automobile that has been converted to run on a wood gasifier engine, because that's the only way he can actually get around at this point in the war. If you're not familiar with a wood gasifier, go Google it. It's like, geez, the technical director of the Mauser company, who they had 500 employees in the R&D division, and he's stuck driving a wood gasifier car because that's how dire the situation is in Germany. Anyway, they managed to scrounge up a steam locomotive, and they take off down towards the Alps, and they managed to get like half a day out into the town of Friedrichshafen, when they are attacked by a flight of Thunderbolt fighters, which proceed to start by shooting up the steam engine and destroying it. And then they just have a jolly time flying around strafing the train, because nothing good, from the Allies' perspective, nothing good's being transported on trains. It's all fair game. Blow it all up. Well, one of the things Lossnitzer comments on is for their experimental machine cannon 214A 55 millimeter, huge frame, that's a huge aircraft gun, which uses rocket-assisted ammunition. In order to simplify things, they had not bothered to make dummy ammunition or practice inert ammunition. All the ammo was live, including the live rocket assist element to it. Well, these P47s strafe up the train car, and they set the boxcar full of live 55 millimeter rocket ammunition on fire, and it burns for several hours, destroys a bunch of stuff. That's got to be an exciting time. They're under fire and the train's exploding around them. Well, eventually the P-47s run out of ammunition and fly back to base. They made a total of, I believe, 3 sorties on the train that day. By the next morning, they finally managed to scrounge up another steam engine that can pull them a bit farther. They get a bit up into the mountains, and then the steam engine disappears. They don't really explain why, but it has to go do other things, and so they're kind of off on a siding, stuck again. And now they're up into the mountains, and the only engine they're able to find at first is this little dinky one that isn't powerful enough to get them through to where they need to go. So they sit basically hiding in a siding on the forest, hoping that these Thunderbolts aren't going to show up again, because they're clearly a target of interest. In total, this whole trip would take about 2 weeks, a week or 2 weeks. The dates are a little bit unclear. But eventually, to cut the story short a little bit, they managed to get hooked up with an electric locomotive, which is able to very effectively pull this train up into the mountains at apparently breakneck speed. Once again, they managed to only get everything in line and leave just at dawn, again making them a fantastic target. They're really worried about further air attacks, and apparently the train engineer just steps on it. And Lossnitzer describes a number of places where, in a very blasé sort of German-style thing, he mentions that despite the fact that we were going uphill and around corners, the train speed never slacked off. And he in fact describes things falling out of the boxcars as they go around curves because they're going so fast, and the Mauser guys who packed these boxcars are not freight engineers. They were frantically shoving things from trucks into boxcars because hours behind them the French army is marching into Oberndorf. And I can just picture in my head this train careening around mountain passes with gun barrels falling out, flying out the side of boxcar. It's a very cinematic sort of escape. Well, eventually, they make it to a town called Ötztal, up in the Alps. And this is their final destination. They actually make it there. And the idea is there are lots of tunnels in the mountain, and it's difficult territory to attack, and they'll be protected there, and they can set up shop and have, this invulnerable resistance to the Allied attack. It's all nonsense. None of it comes to fruition. The train arrives, and they get it parked in the forest and reasonably well hidden from air attack. And Lossnitzer goes out to try and find a place where they can actually unpack the train and do their work, I suppose, because we're here. I guess the country's still happening, so let's get on with it. Finds a number of facilities that theoretically could work, but they're already jam-packed with other people trying to do the exact same thing. Other factories and facilities that have been evacuated into this area, government ministries that have been evacuated into this area. And Lossnitzer is simply unable to find any place that can accommodate Mauser's research crew. So they proceed to, chill out. Lossnitzer has a radio, which is a fairly rare and valuable thing at the time. And so they're listening to German and Allied radio, public radio reports. They hear that Hitler went down fighting with a machine gun in Berlin, which of course didn't actually happen. They get clued into the fact that, hey, you know what? It's all over. The war's done. Germany is finished. But what are they going to do? They don't have any transport. They're stuck in a boxcar full of what they recognize are valuable materials that are going to be of interest to someone. So they just hang out there for about a month. They make some arrangements with local civilians to get some food. They make arrangements with some Allied troops who end up in the area Lossnitzer trades for his little core group of engineers and himself. He starts trading wine that they had brought for field rations from the American army, which works really well for a couple of weeks. U.S. troops had arrived in the area at the beginning of May. But they're not really concerned about this train. These are engineers. This is a company. This is not a military detachment from Mauser. This was a private company. And so they don't really attract a ton of attention. However, intelligence agencies from the US and Britain and France are interested in these people because they know there was a lot of weapons development going on at Mauser, obviously, and they want to find it and find out what happened. In particular, an organization called CIOS, the Combined Intelligence, I mentioned this at the beginning, the Combined Intelligence Objective Subcommittee, CIOS, which is a British-American team. They come looking for this train. They were first dispatched to the Mauser factory, and they go through it and they realize, hey, all the good stuff, all the really sexy new stuff, it's gone. Let's find out where it went, and that's the report here. And so they track down the train, and at the beginning of June, they find it. And that's when life kind of changes a bit for all of these Mauser guys. Guards are placed on the train. Most of the occupants are moved to holding camps. They're all interrogated. Not in a, we think of this as, prison camp interrogation. It's not quite. They want to find out what was going on at Mauser, and so they're going to talk to everybody privately and compare stories and try and deduce what was actually going on. Lossnitzer is very amenable to the Americans. He recognizes the war's over. Nothing he's going to do for Mauser is going to be all that useful at this point. He doesn't really want to go back and work for the French at Mauser, and so he's very happy to be totally cooperative and helpful with the Americans, and in fact he ends up in the United States working for Springfield Armory. But this pretty much ends the story of the train. At this point, some of the good stuff has been destroyed. Of course, they've been attacked a number of times. All this 55mm rockets exploding on the train destroyed a bunch of stuff. What is left is all crated up, and it is first sent to a U.S. Ordnance Depot in Paris, and from there forwarded to Britain. Along the way, it is apparently very thoroughly ransacked by all sorts of people, and there's no record of who was doing it or where the stuff went. But in the report here, they're really quite annoyed that by the time this stuff gets to Britain and then the United States, the vast majority of the value is gone, because a lot of the weapons parts have been scrounged and stolen and liberated by who knows who along the way, and there's just not that much left. Again, their primary interest appears to have been the aircraft cannons. Just it's interesting side notes of how things just, we would like to think of the US and British militaries as well-oiled machines, especially by 1945. They know what they're doing. They've got this down, like it's a professional organization. Well, one of the things Lossnitzer ends up doing is he's ordered to take 3 Me-262 jets and install these 55mm cannons in them so that they can be shipped back to Britain or the US and tested and investigated. And so, okay, well, they've got components for the guns, and they do it. Like, this is what they'd been planning. This is how what the guns were designed to do. And Lossnitzer suggests at the time, he's like, right here, we've got some Me-262 pilots who are like wandering around with nothing to do. You should hire them to fly these planes over to France, where you're going to load them on ships, because they know how to do it. And of course, people didn't trust people, and instead the US puts a couple of its own pilots in these 262s. They'd never flown jets. All 3 of them proceed to crash on landing at Calais. The pilots are fine, but they go crunch right onto the nose of the planes, and all of the guns and mounts are destroyed, and the whole thing is for naught. Like I said, it's a fascinating recollection of first-hand accounts of what was actually going on here. So that is the story of the Mauser train. All the really cool stuff goes on the train because we're going to keep working and keep fighting, apparently, from the Alps, and, well, it didn't actually happen. One other last side note I will mention is those Sturmgewehr 45 parts kits. Those get dispersed a bit. A number of them go to different Allied countries. And in particular, number 20, parts kit number 20, ends up in the hands of a Dutchman by the name of Henk Visser 50 years later. Henk is actually a young man in the Dutch resistance at the time, son of a fairly prominent family. He ends up buying an ammunition factory from the United States that is basically no longer needed, being mothballed. He buys it for a nominal $1 sum, ships all the equipment over to the Netherlands, sets up factory to make 20mm ammunition for NATO, and proceeds to make an immense fortune, and ends up as a major stakeholder in both Mauser and Heckler & Koch. He acquires this Sturmgewehr 45 parts kit and actually has it completed, because they didn't have I want to say the barrels, the receivers, and the stocks, or the barrels and the stocks had never actually been finished by Mauser. Well, Visser owns a quarter of Mauser. So, hey, he just hands him a parts kit and goes, yeah, it's just, put this together for me, which they do. And I actually have a video on that gun if you're interested in what the Sturmgewehr 45 was. Well, that's as close to a complete original one as there will ever be, because it was a kit produced by Mauser in 45 and then finished by Mauser several decades later under the direction of Henk Visser. Sadly, Mr. Visser passed away, 10 or 15 years ago now. But he had a fantastic gun collection and was a fantastic resource for researchers and collectors. Anyway, I've gotten a little bit further off track there. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this story. If you're interested in more of the details, these two books are definitely the ones to get. If you're interested in technical firearms stuff, reading the 350 or 400 pages of report from CIOS of what they found and what Mauser was doing in its research division at the end of the war is a great piece of literature. Highly recommend checking it out. Lossnitzer's biography is a little bit more esoteric, definitely of interest to people who are a little deeper into the subject, and if you can find a copy, I definitely highly recommend that as well. Thanks for watching.